Okay, so today we're talking about the Sphinx. Two main questions. How old is it, and who built it? So I'm going to make this short, sweet, and to the point, much like my blog. I'm usually more detailed in the actual blog than in my videos, because I'm a better writer than I am a speaker. But here we go. So we've been told that the Sphinx is about 4,500 years old and that the Egyptians built it. There is a growing number of scientists who contend that the Sphinx is actually much older, and a growing number of people who are not entirely convinced that it was the Egyptians who built it. So first we're going to talk about the age. So one argument for why the Sphinx may be much older than 4,500 years is weathering. I think many people know that, there's many scientists who are considering the weathering of the Sphinx and looking at environmental factors, trying to get a closer estimate of the age, because you can't date stone. But I think primarily this argument is being led by Dr. Robert Schoch, and he's got a few books out on the subject. If you're really into the Sphinx and you really want to see all of the evidence, I highly recommend checking those out, because that's his area of expertise. He would know about the weathering patterns, and that is just some of the evidence to support the theory that the Sphinx is much older. Other scientists have used other methods. Some scientists, they look at how the Giza Plaza is laid out. They look at how the structures are built. They look at how the Great Pyramids themselves align with Orion's belt, and they're looking at star maps, and they're looking at older star maps, because things have changed, and they are looking for alignments that match up. And what they found were alignments that matched up approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago. So they're approaching the argument with another type of evidence. And of course, others have used a similar method. Instead of, dating back to when the stars lined up, they are considering cardinal north. And because a lot of the ancient structures of the old world, they were built to align to cardinal north. And so they are also dating the Sphinx back to approximately between 10 and 12,000 years ago. So that would suggest that either the Sphinx was not built by the Egyptians, or the Sphinx was built by the Egyptians and their culture is much older, like they say, and maybe they have altered it over the years. Some people, the reason they don't believe that the Sphinx was made by the Egyptians is because the head doesn't appear to match the body. It appears to be smaller, and so some people have suggested that, the Egyptians have altered it in some way. Maybe they repaired it, maybe something happened and they needed to repair it. Some think it might have been originally Horus, and the Egyptians then later changed it to a pharaoh's head. But others think that maybe the Egyptians found the Sphinx. They do say that they found it, that it was buried up to its neck and spoke to them, and they uncovered it. So others speculate that perhaps when they found the Sphinx, it had a different head. Maybe it was a full lion, who knows, and they altered it. So my personal theory is that it is older, I do think it is older than the 4,500 years. Not necessarily as old as 10 to 12,000 years ago. Maybe it's closer to between 6 and 8,000 years ago. That's the thing, is the dating is nearly impossible. It's all just sort of, it's not hard evidence. So it is primarily guesswork, good guesswork, educated guesswork, but so putting the age aside, now I do personally believe that all of the ancient structures are much older than we're being told. For anyone who's read my book or anyone who has been reading my blogs, you know I do believe that our ancestors, our ancient ancestors, our pre-ancestors, if you will, were much more advanced and intelligent than we are, and something happened in prehistory. So I do think that there were truly intelligent, advanced, magnificent civilizations thousands of years ago. Thousands and thousands of years ago. Maybe as much as 50, 100,000 years ago, who knows? But I think, for the sake of this argument, the Sphinx may not be as old as some of the other structures that I think are closer to that between 50 and 100,000 year mark. The reason being is because aesthetics matter. How do archaeologists determine when an artifact belongs to a certain ancient culture? Well, they look at the design. They look at not just the location that it was found, but they look at, you know, how was this made? They look at the technique that went into it, the patterns, what's on it. That is all aesthetics. Different cultures had different aesthetics. And so, like, they can find something and see the bulls and see the design and go, that is clearly Minoan. So for this argument, for my personal speculation, I believe that the Sphinx may have been made by the Sumerians, or perhaps their ancestors, whoever predated them, whoever they are the descendants of. And the reason I believe this is because if you look at the artifacts that were recovered from the Sumerian culture, or at least the photos that still exist of them, you know, unfortunately, due to war and violence and conflict and the tumultuous world that we live in, many of those artifacts have been looted, lost, destroyed. But the photos still exist, and we do know that the Sumerians had a habit of putting their kings' heads, or human heads, or gods' heads, whoever, people heads on animal bodies. They had their own lion bodies and human heads. They had those aesthetics, and they did have quite large ones. They had smaller ones and larger ones. I see no reason why we should rule them out as the possible makers of the Sphinx. And if they did create the Sphinx, it might be a little older than 4,500 years. It might be closer to 6,000 or 7,000, maybe even 8,000, possibly even older if the Sumerian culture dates back further than we realize, or if, you know, they, before they became the Sumerians, if there was a culture pre-existing them that they based their culture from, the, you know, like their origin from. The Egyptians claim to be much older. They claim to be, you know, the Egyptians say that they are the descendants of the Atlanteans. And they claim to be closer to 30,000, a little more than that even, 30,000 to 40,000 years old. So if there were cultures, if the Sumerians are the descendants of a culture that is 30 to 40,000 years old as well, potentially, perhaps it was their ancestors who built that, and that's where they got their aesthetics from. And to that argument, if the Sumerians or their ancestors had built that Sphinx, then it would have had a different head. It would have had a head resembling the Sumerian kings, you know, the big-headed Sumerian kings with the curls. So, of course, if the Egyptians had come across that, and I'm pretty sure the Egyptians would have recognized it as Sumerian, would have known who the Sumerians were, or at least had some idea. And if they had come across that, of course they would have changed it to match their own aesthetics. Of course they would have altered it to make it their pharaoh instead. They may have liked the idea. Maybe it was like, oh, we were inspired by the Sumerian design. We were inspired by the idea of putting a human head on an animal body, but we're going to make that head into the pharaoh, and we're going to adopt this aesthetic instead. And then, of course, they made a bunch of smaller ones. So, in my opinion, the Sphinx resembles something that the Sumerians or a pre-Sumerian culture may have created. That being said, I am also just offering an educated guess based on speculative evidence, based on the aesthetics, the way it looks. So, the Sphinx is a mystery, and one more mystery that pertains to the Sphinx is, you know, whether or not there's a second Great Sphinx, a second larger Sphinx. There's obviously smaller ones, but, you know, people have been looking for a twin to the current one for many years now, and that argument is primarily based, again, on aesthetics. The Egyptians did like symmetry. They had a preference for symmetry, so it's quite possible that if they had made that Sphinx, they might have made a second one. And unfortunately, given that area and the strife it has seen in centuries of strife, millennia of strife even, it's entirely possible that if a second Sphinx did exist, it was destroyed a long time ago. Or that it's somewhere out there buried under that sand. There is just so much buried under the sand, and it's an ever-shifting, ever-changing environment, and not the safest environment to really excavate. And even if it was calm and peaceful and just marvelous over there, there's so much to be discovered under those sands, and it would take a tremendous amount of effort and so many years to uncover it all. And more than likely, we wouldn't uncover but a small percentage of what actually used to exist there. So I personally believe that whether or not there was ever a second Sphinx is always going to remain a mystery. I don't think we're ever going to find a second Sphinx. But if we do, I imagine it would probably look more like the statues we uncovered from the Sumerians. So, short, sweet, to the point, that about sums up my blog. Obviously, like I said, there's more detail. I probably explain it much better in the blog itself. If you want to read that, do check that out. If you like this video, give me a like, give me a share, subscribe, all that good stuff. You know the drill. Stay extra, my fellow terrestrials.